Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will continue our discussion of the article, The Warden's Columns.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have our usual cast of characters who this time I will introduce in order of lodge number. So we have very worshipful brother David Colbeth, who is a member of King Solomon Lodge number 60 here in Washington. Worshipful brother Jarrod Dunham, member of Penticton 147 in Penticton, British Columbia. Worship brother Stephen Chung of Prince Charles Lodge number 153 in Kelowna, British Columbia. And I'm very worshipful Matthew Appel, and I'm member of Mill Creek Lodge number 243 here in Montlake Terrace, Washington. So last time we were discussing an article, we're going to continue our discussion this time of our article, The Warden's Columns, which we got on the educator.ca website, which we'll have a link to in the notes as usual. And we sort of left off, we talked about the warden's columns, the columns that sit on the warden's, senior wardens and junior wardens lecterns and what they do. And we'd started to veer off into other columns. So so we figured we would make that a whole separate episode here, and we'd discuss the columns in lodge. So again, by way of information for non-Masons or whoever might be new listening to the show, in most lodges that I've been in, when you walk into the lodge, somewhere on the symbolically to the west wall, there are usually two columns of, significant height, taller than I am, that have globes on them. They have some fancy work on them. There's a globe and a celestial and terrestrial globe on the tops of them. And they have various meanings and representations and such. And I guess I will use that as my factual introduction and see where we go from there. Does anybody have further thoughts on the columns in lodge?
So I have a question, and I don't know necessarily the answer specifically, other than the diagram that I was looking at. And it's common that in one section of our degrees that there's a pause and everybody kind of, which side of the pillars go on, or the columns go on. So in our intro, which we don't hear because it's already pre-recorded, we say that we have the Grand Lodge has nothing to do with us. Basically, we're independent, and we're not talking on behalf of the Grand Lodge or our lodges in particular. We're just four guys here, hanging out, having a discussion about Masonry. The other part I want to say is that, at least for me anyway, I'm not revealing or talking about anything that's not already written out in any of these books that are public common knowledge. And so I don't think we're sharing any secrets when we're going into these details that I'm going to talk about. But for the diagram that I read, and maybe I guess it's a question, which when you're looking into the lodge room, you're outside the lodge, you're looking in, on which side is the celestial and which side is the terrestrial? Because it talks about the left-hand pillar and the right-hand pillar, right? So which one's the left-hand pillar, which one's the right-hand pillar? As you're looking, if you were out of the lodge, looking into the lodge, which is left and which is right? Or maybe there's a follow-on question there to say, what do you consider the left-hand side of the porch of King Solomon's Temple? Is it the left hand from the inside looking out, or the left hand from the outside looking in?
Left hand.
Jared, you got to speak, Jared. They can't see your nod on Spotify.
Okay, so yes, it's always okay. It's looking in because they're on the outside of the temple, so you're looking in, exactly. And it's always been B on the left, J on the right. So I don't know. I mean, yeah.
So the terrestrial. But that was the question, was which one is the terrestrial, which one's the celestial? So the terrestrial is on the left.
Oh.
The Earth, basically. What we consider the real globe would be
the globe is on the left and the celestial is on the right.
The stars.
Yeah.
as you're looking in on the porch. And that was
as you're entering the lodge.
Yes.
Because you're entering the temple.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was the diagram that I showed, that I had looked at, that I probably should figure out a way to actually, do the fancy thing where we swipe in a video or image here. But again, people on Spotify can't see that, so it doesn't do much good. So if that's the case, then again, not reading, not trying to reveal anything that isn't already public or isn't already written in lots and lots of different places. We say that the senior warden, who is generally in the west part of the lodge, a lodge is an oblong or a rectangle shape, and so if it was in the west short side of the west, he's the pillar of strength, and I've heard at least 3 different versions of the pronunciation. Steve said, I can't even think now what he called it. We call it Jakin or Yakin. I've heard it pronounced Yakin. And then Steve, you had a different pronunciation for that. And Jarrod didn't want to say it. He just said J and B.
Yeah, Jockin. Jockin and Boaz.
Yeah. So, yeah. I'm hedging my bets.
And that's all. The existence of those 2 pillars is from the Bible. They're in the Bible. It's not like Masonry made that up.
No.
But so I've been Googling while everyone else was speaking eruditely. I was Googling, because that's where all knowledge comes from.
All knowledge exists.
Exactly. And according to rimasons.org, which I think is yes, the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island, rhodeislandmasons.org, the celestial globe surmounts Jakin, and the terrestrial globe is on Boaz.
Yes, that's what we tried to say. If that's much more clear, but that's what we tried to say.
So I just want to throw some mud on this. And I'm just going to plug this book because I love this book.
You got to say the words because they can't see it. They can't see it on Spotify.
Network, the Freemason Network mentions when they talk about raising and lowering the columns, that in some jurisdictions, the junior warden and the senior warden both are in the west.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So,
I've read that too, because that's where the idea of the pillars being in the west, the man-sized pillars, let's call them, the full-size pillars, those being in the west, that they represent, they are on either side of the entrance to the temple, the inner temple room, and so the Masons, the members of the lodge, have to enter through those columns.
But if you think about the fact that our predecessors met in non-specific rooms that weren't designed specifically as lodges,
yes, and
had to carry their furniture with them, it would make sense that they would have the columns, which for both on the left, the celestial and the terrestrial, that would be small enough for them to carry and possibly put on top of a pedestal like their podiums.
So do your funny? Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, funny you should say that. My lodge currently meets in a room that is not a lodge room, and we take everything out after every meeting and bring everything in before we meet again. So literally, the whole soup to nuts, the altar, the chairs, everything has to go when we're done with our meeting. So we roll our gigantic columns out of the room when we're done with them into a storage area. Now, it's not very far or anything, so it's doable. But I found myself wondering, when they get, usually it's the deacons set up the lodge room before the meeting. I found myself wondering if do they always go on the same sides, or is it just like, whatever, they roll it out and put it, whichever one they have goes whichever spot they're nearest. I'll have to pay attention. We've got our meeting on Tuesday. I'll have to pay attention.
So, but also the idea of the globes, which could be a whole nother show. The idea of the globes on top of the columns is an innovation. And it talks about how the globes weren't necessarily, for sure, weren't on top of the columns, and maybe weren't even part of some. They were surmounted the master and the ward, or the 2 wardens' chairs at one point, and then another spot I read that the globes were just in the lodge room that were used for instruction, but they weren't part of the column either in the west at all. The other part I was reading about, they said that when he updated the ritual, it was either Webb or Preston, when they updated the ritual, that he got, they think that maybe he used the word deacon incorrectly. It should have been the word warden when he talked about the columns, the deacons having the columns and not the wardens having the columns for reference. But they think that maybe he meant to say warden in type of, to print warden. But I go to your comment about the junior warden and senior warden sitting in the west, where the west representation of the west would be. Well, if you only got 3 guys as a Master Mason's Lodge, that's all you'd have anyway. And so you'd have those 2 columns, and you'd only have, maybe they do sit in the west, kind of like the lesser lights do. And so the wardens would act as the deacons, if you will, to guard against counts and eavesdroppers. Mm-hmm. So, they would act as the deacons, just like the wardens, just like the deacons do now.
And in some lodges, they were actually painted on the floor rather than, physically, carried or ornamental pieces. And yet, there's another section in there that talks about something interesting, that the children, those columns on the porch of King Solomon's temple, these ancient pillars, on them were engraved all the known sciences to preserve them from destruction by fire or inundation, right? So such as they symbolize the esoteric importance of the knowledge of the builder's arts to be guarded and preserved by faithful craftsmen. So that's an interesting theory too, that they were actually, keeping secrets or the sciences preserved, right? I remember another document that some time ago now, but it referred to the pillars as being a more like a storage facility, a safe place to keep these the known sciences and secrets and things like that. Another interesting thought.
If I was a betting man, I would say that the idea of the pillars being a repository is an allusion to the men themselves, because one of the parts I read was that they talk about wisdom, strength, and beauty, but they're actually represented by the officers of the lodge, and the wisdom, the master being the representation of the wisdom, he represents. Wisdom is related to the knowledge of science, right? And so the Master Mason had all the knowledge, and so he was the one that was able to build and to contrive and to order and arrange the workmen and all that kind of stuff. And so he had to contain the knowledge and contain the science of architecture, and the senior warden had to contain the ideas of strength. So now that you had the idea of the building, now you had to build it and make it strong, and then the junior warden had to make it pretty, or gave the advice again to make it pretty. And so those ideas of, are we really talking about physical things inside? Like, yes, they were talking in our ritual, they talk about how they're empty, they're cast empty so they could put stuff inside of them, but are they really? Is it an allusion to the human, to man, in that we're kind of an empty vessel and we need to fill ourselves with knowledge and potential strength and beauty to provide our craft?
And then put a globe on top of our head just so that we have something to spin. Well, it's interesting though, when you think about the Fellowcraft lectures and how they go and they describe the pillars and the beauty they were adorned with and so on, that the whole thing has one involved meaning, right? Which takes it in a whole other direction again, right? Is it more of an education piece?
Yeah, and I would agree that the idea of what do the columns or pillars, what do the columns mean in Lodge? We call them wisdom, strength, and beauty, but they also relate to the 3 columns of Masonry, which are faith, hope, and charity. We've talked about in the past that charity actually means love, and so we're talking about faith, hope, and love. So if you relate the wisdom to faith and strength to hope and beauty to love, I think they work directly together. I mean, faith, you got to have the idea of wisdom. And we also talk about faith being lost in sight. So once you've seen it, now you have the wisdom. So you have to have faith that it's going to work. And then when you see it work, now you don't have to have faith anymore because it's lost in sight. You've seen it work. And so it's now wisdom. Now you've gained that wisdom. And strength, boy, hope and strength relate. If you don't have the strength of hope in your life, it's kind of hope and faith tied directly together as well. You got to have hope and that strength of hope, and charity, or just really love. The idea of brotherly love is beauty into itself.
And it's interesting. We talk about the two columns representing, or the the three principal offices of the lodge representing, wisdom, strength, and beauty, and how these columns are supposed to represent strength and beauty. But in the lodge, there's physically only two columns, and but yet there's three principal officers representing wisdom. But the worshipful master doesn't have a column, right? Yet then we talk about the podiums in front of us, which have the symbolism and representing faith, hope, and charity. So there's the three podiums. So how can the columns actually represent three things when there's only two of them?
So funny. So I don't know as much about this as I would like to, and I should probably go read a book or something. But I know there is a school of thought that relates Masonry to Kabbalism, which would have you, as you, the new Mason, enter the lodge room. Between those two pillars, you, the Mason, form the third pillar of the three columns that are represented in the Kabbalistic drawings. And that's about as far as I know. And I've just exposed my total ignorance, and I will run away now. But I always thought that was sort of an interesting explanation of the third column being the individual.
Well, yeah, I don't know that much about that specific Kabbalistic idea either, but the idea of the three pillars and three columns and three elements. Of course, three itself is an important number to Masonry. But I would say too that when some of that I read was about the temple. The idea of the temple is actually, of course, we already talked about it in our ritual, that the idea of the temple is the man himself, right? So we're a spiritual temple, and so we have to. And supposedly that idea of the man being the temple became more popular with the Christianity movement, and rather than the lodge or the man himself. But when before Christ was crucified, he talked about that. Hey, I'll just destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it again in 3 days. What he's referring to them is, of course, himself, not a physical building. And they didn't understand what that meant, but later they discovered. So that's where the idea that the man himself is actually the temple. That's where we're trying to build our spiritual temple, not made with hands. And that the three columns again relate to the Trinity, right? And that the triangle is a symbol of strength, and it's the symbol of God, the all-seeing eye, and which we say in our ritual that God is the ultimate support of our lodge. And so it all relates to the idea of what these supports are. They're not physical things, they're spiritual or ideological things, allegorical things. And so they have two columns or pillars. Again, it's interesting to go back and forth between this word pillar and column. And it isn't necessarily defined that one is one thing, means one thing, and one means something else. But it somewhat relates that the word pillar is more the allegorical, ideological thing, or a column is the physical thing. The column are those things that sit in the west and the south with the wardens, and or stand at the doorway of entrance. But the pillar are things that we consider ideological, represented by the master, the wardens, represented by faith, hope, and charity, represented by the Trinity, represented by those different things. So I don't know if that's a good definition of pillar versus column or not, but it's just amazing how they all connect and how they're all.
And yet in this paper, it refers to, when you ask the question, how many pillars are in your lodge? There's 3. And what are they? The square, the compass, and the volume of sacred law.
See, I've never heard that before.
I've heard the reference to the square, compass, and the volume of sacred law being the 3 pillars of Freemasonry.
We refer to those as the furniture of the lodge.
Yes. I also refer to them as in our lodge, we refer to them as the furniture, but in other lodges I've gone to, I've heard them, or in somewhere in the past, I have heard it referenced that they are the 3 pillars of Freemasonry.
So I have a little, maybe of a contentious question. We only got a couple of minutes here left in this potential segment, but we talk about how, and again, I'm going to default that I'm not talking about anything that's not already printed and well available to anybody out there. In one of our rituals, we talk about the left-hand pillar denoting strength. But that pillar is named Boaz. And it is for the junior warden, not for the senior warden. But senior warden we denote as wisdom, strength, and beauty, right? we say that the senior warden represents the pillar of strength, but in our ritual we denote that Boaz is the left-hand pillar on the porch and denotes strength. So what did Preston or Webb or somebody in the process mess up and say, "Oh, didn't think that through," or did it change over time? Do you think? Why do we say that the left-hand pillar denotes strength when that actually was represented by Boaz, which is actually the junior warden?
Now you got me wondering, do I need to go back and be clear on that again? Wasn't it you recently talked about? Oh no, it was our district deputy grand master who recently talked about the 2 pillars. I will get back to you guys on this. I will bring it up in the next recording because I'm going to ask him, because he definitely clarified that and had the information to back it up.
And if it is meant to be backwards, then why isn't the right-hand pillar denoted beauty instead of to establish? I don't understand that. So if any of the listeners out there know what those mean or want to dig into it and want to comment on that, I would appreciate those ideas. But I don't know, Matt, you're unmuted. I don't know if you were going to comment on it or if you just get ready to wrap up here, but because we're languishing a little bit. Dave was asking questions and he needs to shut up.
I won't need to put that to a stop. Actually, my comment was actually going to be that Jarrod looked like he was either thought we were all idiots or something that earlier he had a look on his face when I unmuted that was like, what are you idiots talking about?
It's a good we don't have Elon's Neuralink set up because we would all be ashamed when on the show with Jarrod.
No, I was just reading through the Canadian ritual to see if there's any reference like that.
I had to actually draw it out, and then I drew out the pillars to make sure I had them left and right, and then I had to actually draw it all out and think, wait a minute, yeah, why is that denoted strength when it should be beauty if it's the junior warden, and strength should be I don't know. There must be some other reason that I need to go and look into my heaping piles of books.
I mean, just because they represent that, it must be that we have them wrong and they're on the other side. That Jochen must be the one on the left and Boaz must be the one on the right, because Boaz would then be in the west and not in the south and not the west. So
I don't know.
That's, oh man.
So another question I had was, do you, on your columns, now we'll talk about them properly, columns, what the wardens have, we have globes on top of ours, but they're not ornated like terrestrial and celestial. They're just white. Are yours decorated?
Ours are not decorated either. Right.
See that again? That would lend to me that they're ornamental and allegorical and not actual.
And nor do they have the lily work and pomegranate.
Yeah.
Right. They are straight columns. Without all the adornments. We do have a ball on top.
Yeah.
But it is not decorated at all.
Yeah.
I feel like I have seen that somewhere where the Warden's columns wasn't just a plain sphere. Right? Ours are just a plain sphere, but I feel like I have seen it somewhere where they weren't.
It would be a cool addition.
Yeah. Although then you have to have more arguments about which one goes where. So with that note, I believe David has asked enough questions that, that now we will leave him hanging. That concludes our discussion to this week of the Warden's Columns article. It's a good article, and it obviously brings up a lot of questions that, it brought up a lot of questions. When Stephen suggested it, I thought to myself, Warden's Columns, whatever. But there's a lot of stuff in there. Masonry has levels.
And the more books you open and the further you dig, the more, and then it forks off. And again, I opened up, flipped a page. I had a reference to a column on a page, and I thought, wait a minute, this article isn't about the columns, it's about the globes. And then I just started reading, and I thought, I can't go down. I can't read more about that because that's going to divert us into a whole other topic, which maybe it should be a whole other topic about the globes.
It's like another rabbit hole altogether in itself, right?
So with that, on behalf of Stephen and Jarrod and David and myself, I want to thank you all for listening. And again, if you have some insight into the columns, either the Wardens or the Boaz and Jachin, please let us know. We're always willing to learn something new. So with that, on behalf of the guys here and myself, thank you all for listening and have a good night. Goodbye.